It started with a silence so subtle, no one feared it at first. Spring arrived on schedule, flowers opened, but the bees did not come. Beekeepers noticed restless hives, then abandoned combs, then whole colonies collapsing without warning. What looked like a strange season quickly became something far more terrifying. Across valleys, forests, and farmland, the same pattern spread with unnatural speed. A disaster no one had ever recorded was tearing through the bee population. Scientists searched for a familiar cause, but none of the usual explanations fit. It was not one disease, not one chemical, not one climate event. The losses grew week by week, and the scale became impossible to ignore. Bees were disappearing faster than ecosystems could adapt to their absence. Then the first visible consequences began to emerge. Blossoms stayed untouched. Orchard branches looked full, yet fewer fruits began to form. Farmers walked their fields with a rising sense of dread. The land still looked alive, but its hidden cycle had been broken. Soon, harvest predictions fell sharply in multiple regions. Crops that depended on pollination were suddenly uncertain, vulnerable, and frighteningly scarce. Markets reacted next. Prices climbed, supplies tightened, and foods once considered ordinary started to feel fragile and precious. Families noticed empty gardens and fewer buzzing afternoons. Children asked what had happened to the sound of spring. Communities began to understand that this was not just about honey. The disappearance of bees was shaking the very foundation of food and biodiversity. Governments called emergency briefings as public concern intensified. Research institutions shifted resources overnight, treating the collapse as a global ecological crisis. Teams of ecologists, chemists, climate experts and biologists worked in parallel. Every lab searched for clues hidden in soil, air, pollen and bloodlines. Some suspected toxins, others pointed to pathogens, and others warned of rising environmental stress. The data was chaotic, but one truth was clear. Bees were not dying from a single blow. They were being weakened from many directions at once. Meanwhile, ordinary people refused to remain helpless. Citizens planted native flowers, reduced pesticide use, and turned neglected spaces into pollinator refuges. Schools built small habitats, volunteers restored meadows, and urban rooftops became islands of color. Hope began as action, even before answers existed. But recovery did not come quickly. Many restored areas stayed quiet because weakened colonies could not repopulate them. In some farming regions, workers tried pollinating crops by hand. It was exhausting, slow, and nowhere near enough to replace nature's precision. The crisis deepened through another brutal season. More queens failed, more hives went still, and fear spread faster than confidence. Several early scientific solutions looked promising in controlled conditions, but once tested in the real world, most of them failed. Heat, drought, habitat loss, and chemical exposure interacted in unpredictable ways. Every failed trial reminded the world how complex living systems truly are. Pressure mounted on leaders to act immediately, no matter the risk. But rushed action carried the danger of causing even deeper ecological damage. Then, inside that uncertainty, a breakthrough finally appeared. Researchers identified a cascading chain of stress that was pushing bees beyond recovery. That discovery changed everything. The answer would not be one cure, but a coordinated system of protections working together. The plan combined safer farming methods, habitat restoration, targeted biological support, and stricter seasonal protections. It was bold, costly, and difficult to deploy. Still, nations, farmers, scientists, and communities began moving in the same direction. For the first time, the response matched the scale of the threat. Wildflower corridors were planted between fields and forests. Harmful spraying schedules were reduced, and bee-safe practices became part of agricultural planning. Special hive support programs were introduced in the hardest-hit regions. Colonies received protection during the most vulnerable stages of their cycle. At first, The results were almost invisible. Losses slowed, but people still feared they had acted too late. Then the monitoring reports began to shift. Foraging routes stabilized, queens survived longer, and more young colonies endured. The numbers were still delicate, but they were finally rising. What had been a collapse was becoming a fragile recovery. Season after season, the improvement gained strength. Orchards began fruiting more reliably, and farms saw pollination return to the land. Meadows regained their movement, and gardens found their rhythm again. The soft hum of bees returned to mornings once filled with absence. Children noticed it before anyone explained it. The air sounded alive again, and that sound meant life was repairing itself. Scientists remained cautious, refining the solution and sharing data across borders. Recovery was real, but protection had to become permanent. Communities changed with the lesson they had learned. Bees were no longer seen as background life, but as vital partners in survival. The crisis revealed how fragile abundance truly is when nature is neglected. But it also proved that collective effort can reverse even severe damage. As ecosystems strengthened, harvests improved, and balance slowly returned. Forests, farms, and cities all responded to care with renewal. In the end, the world became better, not by escaping disaster, but by learning from it. The bees returned, nature healed, and life moved forward in harmony. This place looks like the end of the world. A land of cracked earth, burning light, and endless silence, where life seems to have vanished long ago. Here, only sand remains. Sand, heat, and the rusted bones of a forgotten past. Even the wind feels like it is trying to erase every trace of human life. 50 years ago, the last families were preparing to leave. The wells were dry, the fields were dead, and even the future of their children seemed buried beneath the dunes. But then, a small community made a different choice. Instead of running from the desert, they chose to stay and attempt something almost unimaginable. They were not dreaming of a small oasis. They were imagining a forest in the heart of one of the harshest deserts on Earth. To everyone else, it sounded impossible. But history is often changed by the people who refuse to accept what the world calls fate. The plan was bold, almost absurd in its scale. Yet beneath that madness was a simple idea: bring water from the sea and carry life back into the desert. For them, the ocean was no longer a distant horizon. It became the first source of renewal, the place where the desert's transformation would begin. The first task was brutal. They had to carve channels through hardened ground, opening pathways that could carry water deep into the barren interior. Women, men, and children all took part. Before the forest could rise from the earth, it had to be built by human hands. The same sun that had scorched this land for generations became their greatest ally, powering the machines that would turn salt water into survival. And then the moment finally came. First a few drops, then a thin stream, then the miracle the desert had forgotten: flowing water. This was more than water. It was memory returning to the soil. The first saplings were planted like quiet promises of a future no one had ever seen here before. That night, everyone was exhausted. But for the first time, their exhaustion meant something. The desert was no longer completely silent. Days later, the first green shoot broke through the ground. Then another. Then another. For the first time, the desert itself seemed to hesitate. Every leaf became proof that this land was still alive beneath the surface. Every drop whispered that their struggle had not been in vain. But nature does not surrender easily. On the horizon, a dark line began to rise, the warning sign of something far more powerful than hope. It was the largest sandstorm in a century, and the new life they had planted, still weak and shallow-rooted, stood directly in its path. In a matter of hours, wind and sand tore through everything. Water channels were buried, young trees bent and vanished beneath the storm. What had taken years of labor was swallowed almost instantly. Their work disappeared into a wall of dust, as if the desert were taking it all back. When the storm finally passed, the silence returned. But now it fell over buried saplings, broken channels, and a future that suddenly looked fragile again. The question was no longer how to build a forest. The question was whether this was the end, or only the beginning of a harder lesson. They did not give up, because what they had lost was not only trees. They had also gained something far more valuable: understanding. They realized they could not defeat the wind. So instead, they began designing a way to live with it. They dug the water deeper. They reinforced the channels. They stopped trying to force life onto the land and started building the conditions life needed to survive. This time, every sapling was protected. Every root was shaded. Every mistake from the first attempt became part of a smarter design. Then, one morning, the sign they had been waiting for appeared. From inside the protective barrier, a new green branch reached toward the light. In that moment, they understood something profound. The desert had not been defeated, but for the first time, it had been pushed back. Years passed. Saplings became groves. Groves became woodland. Roots held the soil held the water, and the water called life back into the land. Dry valleys began to flow again. First came insects, then birds, then the countless sounds of an ecosystem remembering how to breathe. This forest did not only grow trees, it rebuilt a society. It returned shade, food, shelter, and the possibility of a future. Today, where a sea of death once stretched to the horizon, a living world now stands. Nothing is truly impossible. Some things are simply waiting for people brave enough to believe.